When an ordinary traffic stop spirals into a moment that could define an entire career, a police officer's worst assumptions crash head-on with a truth he never imagined. His intended target turns out to be the very man who will determine his fate. The sun was beginning its slow descent over Sacramento's streets, brushing the sky with streaks of amber and gold. Eric Porter was driving home after another exhausting day at work. The hum of his sedan blended with a faint breeze from the air conditioning as he tried to shake off the fatigue that clung to him. A soft tune murmured from the radio, an easy counterpoint to the restless energy of the city. He approached the yellow light and eased off the gas just as it switched to red. Then came the flash of blue and red lights behind him, accompanied by the piercing wail of a siren. Eric's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his brows knitting together. He carefully pulled over and rolled down his window as a patrol car stopped behind him. From it stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, buzz-cut, badge catching the last rays of sunlight. Adjusting his utility belt, Larson walked toward the driver's side with a steady swagger of someone accustomed to authority. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone flat but edged with command. Without a word, Eric complied, opening the glove box, retrieving his papers, and handing over his license. His movements were smooth and deliberate, but he could feel Larson's eyes studying him, looking for some invisible flaw. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Larson asked, leaning toward the open window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric answered evenly, polite yet firm. "You didn't make a complete stop at that light," Larson replied, though a flicker of doubt crossed his voice. Eric frowned slightly but gave a small nod. "I see. I thought I slowed in time, but I understand." Larson didn't immediately respond. Instead, he lingered, squinting at Eric as though the simple infraction had transformed into something bigger. His posture changed, subtle but clear. He had decided this was more than routine. Glancing at the license in his hand, Larson asked, "You're not local, are you?" "I moved here a few months ago," Eric said after a brief pause. "The address on the license is current." But Larson wasn't really listening. His tone sharpened, suggesting his questions had little to do with traffic laws. Eric's calmness seemed to bother him. "Where were you headed in such a rush?" Larson pressed. "Just home," Eric replied, voice steady though the tension was thick enough to taste. Larson no longer saw just a driver. He saw something, or someone else, something that demanded suspicion. Eric could feel the weight of it, but he refused to flinch. His calm wasn't ignorance, it was restraint. And this was only the beginning. Larson stepped back, folding Eric's papers with deliberate slowness before slipping them into his chest pocket. His expression shifted to one of smug certainty, as if he'd already decided the story. "Step out of the vehicle," Larson ordered. Eric's hands tightened briefly on the wheel, but his face remained composed. "Is there a particular reason, officer?" he asked, voice measured. Larson's lips twitched but quickly stilled. "I asked you to step out. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The unspoken warning hung between them like static. Eric exhaled and opened the door. As he stepped out, Larson's gaze roamed over him, evaluating, measuring. Eric was slightly taller, broad-shouldered but calm, his tailored suit marking him as a professional. His polished shoes hinted at precision, discipline, but none of that mattered to Larson. "Hands where I can see them," the officer said, gesturing toward the hood. Eric complied smoothly. "Is there something in particular you're searching for, officer?" Larson's smirk was thin. "Routine check. We've had a few incidents lately. Can't be too careful." Eric turned his head just slightly, meeting his eyes. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or is there something else you're looking for?" The question hit like a slap. Larson's face stiffened, his hand drifting toward his belt, a reflex more than intent. "What's your tone?" he warned, his voice hard. "I'm simply asking," Eric said quietly. Eric responded, his voice devoid of defiance, only a quiet steadiness that seemed to unsettle the officer. Larson leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You seem a little too comfortable with all this. Got something you'd rather I didn't find?" Eric let the pause linger before speaking. "No, officer. I just think it's important to be clear about the purpose of these encounters. Transparency, you understand." Larson gave a dismissive snort but stayed silent, pacing a small semicircle in front of the vehicle. The atmosphere was shifting in ways he couldn't name. Eric wasn't reacting like most people. No trembling, no rushed explanations, no anxious movements. Instead, he radiated composure, controlled, deliberate, calm in a way that put Larson on edge. "You seem sure of yourself," Larson muttered, half under his breath. "Like you already know what comes next." Eric didn't bite. He merely tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't really the question here, officer. It's about respect." Larson froze for an instant before turning back toward him. The smugness had drained from his face, replaced by something sharper, defensive, almost uncertain. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. Eric's steady demeanor was throwing him off balance, and he could feel control slipping away. The silence stretched, charged and heavy. Larson realized this wasn't going to unfold the way he'd imagined. But instead of easing up, he hardened. The real test was only beginning. He tapped a few fingers against the side of his holster, his irritation barely masked. Being challenged wasn't something he experienced often, certainly not by a man like Eric. His gaze darted toward the sedan, searching for a justification he hadn't yet invented. "Turn around." Hands on the hood, Larson ordered sharply. "I'm going to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, incredulous but still controlled. "Do I strike you as the type to carry one?" Larson's jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, his self-control slipped. "I'm not asking again." A flicker, something unreadable, passed through Eric's eyes before he quietly turned and placed both palms on the hood of his car. Larson moved closer, his boots crunching against the pavement, the sound slicing through the stillness. The pat-down was brisk and rough, his hands lingering longer than needed. It wasn't just a search. It was an assertion of dominance, an invitation to react. Eric didn't take it. No tension, no flinch, no resistance. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back. The words sounded reluctant, as though he resented saying them. Eric faced him again, calm but piercing. "Of course I am," he said evenly. "Now, if we're finished here." "I'm not finished," Larson snapped, his voice rising just a touch too quickly, betraying the urge to regain control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain that?" Eric crossed his arms, posture loose despite the electric tension between them. "I've had a few experiences with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say it's been educational." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That right? You a lawyer or something?" A faint smile tugged at Eric's lips. "Something like that." The ambiguity grated on Larson. He stepped in closer, invading personal space, his tone dropping to a low growl. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met his gaze without flinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I believe in fairness, and I'm not seeing much of it right now." The words landed hard, hanging between them like a live wire. Larson took the bait without realizing it. "Fairness?" he spat. "You think this is about fairness? People like you always." He stopped short, cutting himself off mid-sentence. The rest lingered in the air, unsaid but obvious. Eric didn't move, but the subtle shift in his stance said he'd heard every word. "People like me," he echoed softly, his voice carrying quiet weight. Larson stiffened, stepping back as if aware he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I meant," he muttered, though his tone had lost its edge. "I think I do," Eric replied. His calmness was no longer mere composure. It was precision, sharp enough to slice through every layer of pretense. "And I think we both understand this stopped being about a traffic stop a long time ago." Larson tried to speak, but nothing came out. "Here's a word-for-word rewrite of your passage. The meaning, rhythm, and atmosphere remain exactly the same, but every line is freshly phrased for originality and flow while preserving the cinematic tone." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Larson's face. He looked unsure, as if suddenly at a loss for what to do next. The balance of power had shifted, and the ground beneath him was no longer solid. But the true reckoning was still ahead, and it would be one he would never forget. Eric's voice cut through the thick silence, steady, composed, and absolute. "Officer, I think it's time you knew who I am." Larson's brow tightened, irritation flashing back like muscle memory. I don't care who you are, he snapped, though the small tremor in his tone betrayed him. Eric reached into his pocket, every motion slow and intentional. I'm reaching for my badge, he said evenly, his eyes locked on Larson's as the officer's hand twitched toward his holster. No need for dramatics. I just want you to see it. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. Larson's gaze tracked Eric's hand as he drew out a worn leather wallet and flipped it open. Inside gleamed a polished badge. Eric Porter, he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Eric's face, searching for any trace of humor. But there was none, only the weight of quiet authority and unmistakable disappointment. Internal Affairs. Larson echoed, his voice faltering. Yo! Yes, Eric interjected, sparing him the rest. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to make sure that the people who wear this badge actually live by the principles it stands for. Larson's complexion drained. His confidence collapsed by degrees. He stepped back, his hand falling from his belt as if his own authority had turned heavy in his grasp. Eric stepped forward, closing the distance Larson had created. Do you know what the most disturbing part of this exchange has been, Officer Larson? He asked, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. Larson said nothing. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd wandered into quicksand. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, his tone steady, though that's bad enough. And it's not even the needless escalation. What's most troubling is that you did all of this without ever stopping to consider who you were speaking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the very laws you're supposed to uphold. And why? Larson opened his mouth, but no sound came. Eric didn't give him the chance. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone who deserves respect, he finished. His voice wasn't raised, but every syllable carried the weight of judgment. And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you deal with in that uniform. Larson's shoulders slumped, the full force of Eric's words sinking in. His eyes flicked to the badge again, as if hoping it might vanish if he looked away. Eric took a half-step back, granting him room to breathe, but not reprieve. Here's what's going to happen, he said evenly. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. Larson's lips parted, but hesitation trapped him. For a split second, he seemed caught between pride and fear. The pause was costly, because, Eric added, his tone lowering to something colder, you're going to hear from me again, not as a driver you pulled over, but as a man who decides whether you're still qualified to wear that badge. Larson swallowed hard, color rising in his face as a reality settled in. With a trembling hand, he reached into his chest pocket and withdrew Eric's license and registration. Eric accepted them silently, tucking the papers into his wallet. He moved toward the driver's side door, resting one hand on the handle before glancing back over his shoulder. Remember this, Officer Larson, he said quietly. The badge doesn't make you superior to anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. Eric slid into his seat, started the engine, and pulled away. Behind him, Larson stood in the fading sunlight, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was only the beginning. The confrontation would echo through the department before long. The drive home was silent, though his thoughts were anything but. He replayed the scene, not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer he'd encountered like that, and Eric knew he wouldn't be the last. Only this time, things would change. This time, Eric had the authority to make sure of it. The following morning, sunlight poured through the blinds of his office as Eric sat at his desk, preparing for what came next. Would you like me to continue the rewrite from this point, picking up with Eric's morning at the office and how he handles the aftermath, e.g., his report or confrontation with the police chief? At the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, an open case file rested on Eric Porter's desk. The name across the top, Officer Bradley Larson. The record wasn't spotless. There were notes of minor complaints, unprofessional conduct, unnecessary stops, vague misunderstandings that had quietly disappeared without follow-up. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed on the pages before him. Larson wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom. The real problem ran deeper, systemic, cultural, and Eric had no interest in applying a temporary fix to a festering wound. A knock broke his concentration. His assistant, Linda, stepped in carrying a neat stack of folders. "Good morning, Mr. Porter," she said briskly. "I got the summary of last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about next week's department review." Eric nodded, taking the reports from her hands. "Thanks, Linda. And can you set up a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon? There's something important I need to go over." She hesitated a moment, catching the weight in his voice. "Of course," she said quietly, before slipping back out. Eric returned to Larson's file, though his thoughts were no longer limited to one man. This was bigger, about the environment that bred officers like Larson and let them believe such behavior was acceptable. And Eric knew one thing for certain. Culture began at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a glass-walled conference room. Daniels, a veteran with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for being pragmatic, listened closely as Eric recounted the details of the traffic stop. "I could have treated it like another bad incident," Eric said, his tone calm but firm. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's conduct isn't an exception. It's evidence of how far we still have to go." Daniels exhaled, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the first time I've seen Larson's name in a report," he admitted. "But we've always dealt with it internally, quietly." "And that," Eric replied, "is the issue. Silence doesn't solve it. Silence keeps it alive. It's time we stop being quiet." Daniels leaned back, studying him. The gravity of the conversation showed on his face. "What are you suggesting?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without pause. "Not just of individuals, of everything. Training, procedures, accountability. We can't keep pushing this under the rug. If we don't demand more from ourselves, why should the public trust us?" Daniels clasped his hands on the table, thoughtful. "You know this is going to ruffle feathers." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks blurred into a storm of meetings, interviews, and data analysis. Eric poured himself into the work, reviewing cases, meeting officers, hosting community forums to hear firsthand how people felt about law enforcement. The Larson encounter became a spark, a catalyst for something larger. It pushed the department to confront its reflection in the mirror. As for Larson, an internal hearing was scheduled. Eric attended personally, sitting across from the officer as the proceedings unfolded. Larson shifted uncomfortably under the questions, the scrutiny cutting deeper than he'd expected. The outcome was a suspension, but Eric knew the real success wasn't the punishment. It was a precedent. The victory wasn't about one man being held accountable. It was about preventing the next one from making the same choices. Months later, Eric stood at a podium in a crowded community center. The audience, a mix of officers, local leaders, and residents, watched as he spoke. His words carried not blame, but purpose. Not accusation, but responsibility. "Justice," Eric said, his voice resonating through the hall, "isn't only about catching criminals. It's about ensuring that those sworn to protect the public do so with integrity, fairness, and respect. Every badge represents that promise, and it's our job to make sure it's honored." The crowd erupted in applause, but Eric didn't bask in it. For him, this wasn't the end. It was the start of something better. As he stepped down from the podium, he caught glimpses of faces in the audience, some skeptical, others hopeful, but all attentive. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen, and for now, that was enough.